African American students with disabilities in Alabama. The plague of whiteness is a measurement of normality. The battleground for education equality is as old as the foundation of America and remains emblematic of a system that perpetuates racial inequality. Historian James Anderson argues that from Americans' conception of universal education, institutions were built on the overlapping notions of citizenship and democracy. As such, there are two distinctly different practices of education: schooling for democratic citizenship and schooling for second-class citizenship. Anderson points that education began as a way to ensure emancipation, and because it quickly aligned with freedom and citizenship, Blacks have continually fought to access it. However, the battle against racism at that time proved too fragile, making it impossible to hold a parallel conversation about disability in an era saturated by Jim Crow. Thereby, the beliefs that held African Americans as inferior cannot be disentangled from the ways in which education developed, nor their treatment if they gained entry into special education programs. Entrance into the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and the Blind proved difficult for African Americans. Measures aside from disability were used as a criteria for admissions. Race was a primary factor. Access to a medical diagnosis confirming disability, unilateral decisions made by the staff based off perceived behavior of the future student, economic position, and whether or not the families had the ability to pay for transportation to and from campus, clothes, postage for required weekly letters sent home, as well as Black ASL, which varies both by culture and region, and last, intelligence testing. Circulation of popular ideas conflating disability with intelligence proved violent for African Americans. Early studies claim that, although the reason for mental retardation of the deaf is unknown, the fact that they are, as a group, mentally backward is quite evident, but goes a step further, promoting the notion of inferiority when talking about African Americans. A 1920 report read, "In every case, the Negro IQ is below that of the whites, with results that show the Negro decidedly inferior to white on standard intelligence tests." Methods employed to uphold white supremacy at the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and the Blind secured a pathway for African Americans with disabilities to remain socially and economically disadvantaged. The historical roots of systemic racism created deplorable health and sanitary conditions. Pictured here is the overflow dormitory for African American boys, housing 19 students and a fireman, with no running water or a toilet. It is important to note that the cramped quarters made it extremely difficult to communicate using sign language. The social deprivation experienced by African Americans stunted language development. Placement of students into classrooms with a vast range in age, cultural, regional, and language variations contributed to difficulties with language growth. The practices of whiteness as a measurement of normality were used to justify the relegation of African American students into remedial vocational programs instead of academia. Pictured here are African American blind students receiving vocational instruction in a poorly ventilated and cramped space. The historical question here becomes, if practices can ensure the transition into remedial economic positions, how then are they handled? The answer across America is a state incarceration in some form. John Doe number 24 and Junius Wilson are not isolated cases of state incarceration regarding Black individuals with deafness. Rather, a testament of their lived experience speaks to a larger trend in American history. The school-to-prison pipeline has its roots in early 20th century practices, targeting the most vulnerable, African Americans with disabilities. Alabama is a case study, earmarking the educational experience for African Americans with disabilities across the nation. Racism in special education was a difficult terrain for African Americans to navigate. Professor Japreet Birdie explains the paradox of being deaf and writes that individuals are caught between two worlds and striving to normalize through a hearing world. In Alabama, we see how the predicament for African American changes as they grapple with the ways to handle a group of people who cannot conform to whiteness and to a hearing world. We must eradicate educational inequality and disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline so that the statement made by the 2019 Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice is no longer relevant. Racial disparities in education remain a central problem.